go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. This is the Things of the Environment and Society Seminar Series. And before we get to today's talk, I'd just like to make an announcement of next week's talk, which was a little bit last minute, but I wanted to make sure people heard about it. And it's entitled Integrating Spatial Data, Mapping Social Values in Relation to Energy and Water Resources. And Amy Popowitz from NACE Conservancy and States, certainly from the Colorado Water Institute at CSU, will be speaking, and it will be, I believe, here. So I am very happy to introduce our two speakers for today. The first will be Dr. Nicholas Flores, and he is the Department Chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Colorado. His research interests include decision-making in the environment, environmental and public goods valuation, and research methodology in environmental economics. He also works with the Institute of Behavioral Science as a faculty research associate and hosts the annual CU Environmental and Resource Economics Workshop. And Dr. Jason Shogren is Assistant Professor of Natural Resource Conservation and Management in the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of Wyoming. And his research interests include private motives of public policy for environmental and natural resource issues. Without further ado, I'll let Dr. Flores get started. So, if you would like a pointer, that is relevant. If you'd like a pointer, this does not actually turn off. That's perfect. But it does work.
So can you hear me? Okay, I guess you could hear me without this thing. This is for the folks who are streaming in. Well, thank you for inviting me today. Jay is also a department chair as well, just to say that. Anyway, so I got invited to give the talk, and this isn't my area of research, but Patty said, well, we want somebody that could talk about valuing carbon markets, and I said, sure, I teach it and I think about it all the time. I didn't realize that 90% of the participants or the people in the audience were going to be economists, so maybe I'm feeling like this talk may be a little irrelevant. So anyway, without further ado, I'll give you a little outline of the things I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the principles of market-based instruments for controlling CO2 emissions, a little bit about how cap and trade works, and I also want to talk about carbon tax, because obviously that's something that's getting more and more attention recently, and there's actually a proposal. Weird Al Yankovic has got a proposal in the Senate, right, to have a carbon tax, and so I want to go over that a little bit. Highlight a little bit of things that are going on elsewhere in the world, in the United States, where we're using these market-based instruments, both with regard to cap and trade and with regard to taxes. Then talk about some of the elements that have been discussed by economists for a U.S. plan for CO2 emissions reductions. And then I've got a table where I'm going to talk about the tax implications, something that I've found recently that the Congressional Research Service did in response to the proposed carbon tax. Okay, so that will be the talk, and then we'll get on to the really interesting stuff in Jacob's talk. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the principles of market-based instruments. So if you think about it, I think economists are very good about identifying problems and then trying to think about, well, how can we solve them, right? So the primary objective here is we have, CO2 emissions are greenhouse gases. They force global warming, and we have climate change, right? And so that's, if you believe that, if you believe it's a problem, then it might be worth solving. Not everyone believes it's a problem, but a lot of intelligent people think that, and some intelligent people think not so. So if we look at an objective of reducing CO2 emissions, economists would like to do this at the least cost possible. And so that's what market-based instruments are about. Okay. So why do we want to use markets? So I'm going to talk first about just achieving any level of emissions reduction. So why do we like CO2 markets? So for those of you who are not economists, it might be easier to think first about water rationing. So think a little bit about water rationing, right? And so let's suppose that you're someone who has a lawn and you dump water all over it. Right? You dump water all over it, and your lawn is just really super green, and then they start water rationing. And we want to think about cutting you back 10%, cutting someone back who's really lean on water. Right? So somebody who's really lean on water. So the relative pain of cutting back is really different for somebody who's kind of a water hog, right, and someone who's really lean and uses hardly any water. Right? So a 10% reduction for the water hog may mean that you don't water on Tuesdays. Right? You don't water on Tuesdays, but for somebody else it may mean that they don't get to wash their clothes, right? And so there you have an example of kind of the costs of reduction are really different, right? So with reduction of CO2 emissions, we could think of the same thing. So for some people, if we look across countries, it's a good example. So Japan is very carbon lean. For Japan to reduce further emissions, it's really expensive for them to do so. Like photovoltaics to them look like a really good deal, right? Look like a really good deal. Whereas the United States, on the other hand, we haven't done much in the way of abatement, and so it's pretty inexpensive for us to abate. And so we like markets because if we start forcing people to pay a price for their carbon emissions, then it gives them the incentive to cut back. But more importantly, if people are operating optimally, we'll have the marginal abatements like costs across firms and across households will be the same. And we like that because that's a cost minimizing condition for doing carbon reductions at the cheapest price possible. So this is why economists are obsessed with market-based mechanisms for dealing with this. Let's see. Have I missed anything here? So this equimarginal condition turns out to be really important. Right? And so that's why we really like these market-based instruments. That's really their primary virtue. That's their primary virtue. Not so much that economists love markets. It's just that markets in this case do the trick. Okay, so let's think a little bit about cap and trade. All right, so cap and trade, I think in some ways, I think in the long run it may lose favor a little bit. But the basis for cap and trade is, we have a cap, and people can only emit CO2 right, if they have a tradable permit. We want these tradable so that we can move them across people because of these differential costs of reducing CO2 emissions. So permits are limited to the cap, so you've got to have some sort of authority, right, usually the government, some sort of authority that's going to limit emissions. And we could set the cap so high where it's not even binding, right? When we think about it today, we set a CO2 cap for the United States, it's really high. It wouldn't be binding, so some of it is how strict it is, right? Think about strictness. Typically, the schemes that have been discussed and have been implemented around the world are, over time, the cap is ratcheted down, right, making things more and more scarce. What do we like about this? So if these are traded in a market, the permits can flow to the most highly valued use, i.e. the people who it's really expensive for them to reduce, right? So if you think about, if I can reduce really inexpensively, I could do that versus someone it's really expensive to reduce, and they might need to buy those permits or buy more of them. So that's the basic idea. So really, it internalizes what we like about this is by having to have a permit, and a permit has a scarcity value to it, it kind of internalizes the cost. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned so far is we're really just thinking about emitting and the cost of reducing emissions, right? Cost of reducing emissions. There's another side of this that's how far we want to go. Right? So how far would we like to go? Economists there's a tradition in welfare economics where in the theory of externalities where we like to tax people for their damages, right? So we tax, if we put a tax to what the cost we like people to have to pay when they put externalities on others, we like for them to pay the marginal damages that they're causing. One of the problems with CO2 emission is it's a crapshoot. We don't really know all the costs. We don't really have a good idea of the marginal costs of CO2 emissions because a lot of the damages we don't understand. They're going to be off in the future. So in a sense, we don't have a really good idea of that, but we'd like to price carbon anyway because we know the following. So right now in the United States, there's no carbon tax or there are no tradable permits, so there's no internalization of those externalities. So we know that it's inefficient right now. Right? So the level of CO2 emissions is inefficient. And we like to push a little bit back on that. So we can think of it as we can either put a really big, a really tight cap, and that could be very costly. It may go too far, but somewhere in between. We know that there's an emissions reduction level that's too much. Right? We know that, but we've got there's a lot of space between where we are now and where we could go. Okay. So one of the things distinguishes a cap and trade system from the tax system that I'm going to talk about in a moment is one of the things we know is we fix the cap and we know what the emissions are going to be. Right? We fix the cap and we know what the emissions are going to be, but we don't know what the price is going to be. Right? So the big issue here is how expensive is it for people to reduce their emissions, and that's an unknown. Right? That's an unknown. We have some ideas. Right? We have some ideas, but until we go out and do it, we really don't have a good idea. So cap and trade, emissions are fixed, but it could be very expensive if we tighten things down enough. In contrast, if you don't tighten things down too much, and it turns out that it's really cheap, and you have all these permits floating around out there, the value of permits is really low. And that's been the experience. I'll talk about it a little bit in the European Union. Okay. One of the, there has been an evolution on the idea of how we provide the permits. Right? So one possibility, and one that's had a lot of traction, is so you've got these people who need permits, and we're going to give them some. We're not going to give them as many as they're using now, but we'll grandfather them, give them, let's say, 95% of give them permits for 95% of their emissions level, and they're going to have to do some reducing, and we can give them to them. Another alternative would be to auction them off. Right? So I think there's been an evolution in thinking, but definitely when we give them away, businesses are much friendlier towards this. Right? So I had a call a few years ago from these small gasoline refiners. They were looking, there's all the talk about tradable permits, and they were really worried about this. The reason they were really worried because they didn't think that they had the financing in place. They thought they would be running into a problem of financing enough permits to carry on their business in a given year. And I told them, I said, if I were you, I'd really argue for a tight cap and they give you the permits. Right? So because you're going to be a lot better off for that. At least you have something of value. And so, if you're giving them away, it gives something of value to the firms, but they still are under the system. In contrast, if we auction them off, you just have to pay out, and it works a lot like a tax. Okay, emissions tax. So the basic idea here, and I'll go into some more details, is put a direct price on emissions. Right? Put a direct price on emissions. Most of the time, if you think about it, we put a tax on tomorrow. We put a carbon tax on tomorrow. Probably there isn't going to be much adjustment in the short term, but over time, people will adjust, right? And they'll be able, when we had the price of gasoline went over $4 a gallon a few years ago, I have a lot of friends who have giant trucks because they have horses. They're abandoning those trucks. Right? They're abandoning those trucks in a hurry because they're trying to adjust to this high cost. So you can put a tax on. People will do some adjustment, but and so there will be some reduction, right, in emissions. The idea is you can adjust eventually over time, raise the tax, and you can lower emissions accordingly. The thing we like about these, and similar like the permits do the same thing, gives you an incentive to reduce emissions in order to lower your taxes. Right? In order to lower the taxes. Again, we like this notion of the marginal cost of abatement is equal across everybody, right? And so let me try to count. I know a lot of you are economists in the room, but those of you who aren't economists, the thing is if we have two people who want to achieve an emissions reduction and their marginal abatement costs are different, I think we could actually have gains from trade, right? So if someone who's at a really, we could basically think about if Jay and I have really differential marginal abatement costs, and my costs are really high and his are really low, we could trade off, and I could basically pay Jay. My costs are high. I could pay Jay, and we could keep the emission levels the same, and we would have gains from trade, right? And so we don't want to have that condition, right? And so that's why we like these uniform price across people because it achieves that. Okay. Now, in contrast to the cap and trade, here we know the price of the emissions, right? So we can definitely calculate an upper band on how much it would cost people, even just looking at their current consumption levels. But the thing we don't know is, well, what's going to happen with the emissions reduction? So that's the unknown. So we've got two different sides of the coin. In the United States, we don't like taxes. We don't like taxes, and it's a tough sell. In fact, if you look around the world, there have been a lot of proposals in the past 10 years in countries all over the world where they try to put on a carbon tax, and it'll look like it's going to go through, and then it doesn't. And then it doesn't, because people line up behind it and say, this is terrible. I won't give you my personal opinion. Okay, so here's some examples. I was just thinking about, I'll just say, I like the idea of taxes more. I just think that they're a lot more flexible. But let's look, here are two examples of cap and trade. So the European Union has an emissions trading scheme, and basically it just targets emissions from power and heat generators, energy-intensive industries, and commercial aviation. I don't know if you saw I guess in the past month, they started putting taxes on all flights in and out of Europe. Right? They started charging carbon taxes in the United States, started really balking at our carriers having to pay this. Right? But these are the sectors that are generated, so it's not complete coverage, right? It's not complete coverage. Not included in this are people driving their cars, heating their houses, and that's, well, actually heating their houses with electricity, they've got that. So how did they, initially they provided permits for free, and now they're moving, in 2013 they auctioned off 40% of the emissions permits. Clean development mechanisms. So this has turned out to be a really important feature of the European Union's cap and trade system. And basically what the clean development mechanism is people can create carbon reducing projects in developing countries and get emissions permit credit for those. Okay? And some people think that this has really undermined the trading scheme because it's created a glut of emissions credits, because there are a lot of places around the world where you can create emissions reducing projects and they're really cheap, and so you can keep doing that as long as you can sell the permits. And I don't know, I think that things are drying up a little bit on that because the price of permits is so low that there's not much benefit from creating these CDM projects. So remember what I said, that with the cap and trade, the emissions are fixed, but the price fluctuates. And the price has fluctuated wildly for permits on the European market, from €3 to €32. And at one point, there was a danger, I guess it was in 2010, that they thought that the market was collapsing because there were too many of these permits coming in from CDM, and so that's kind of threatened the system. In the United States, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, cap and trade system in the Northeast U.S. Started out with 10 states, and then it went down to 9 after Chris Christie withdrew New Jersey from this. Puts a cap on emissions from power plants. So in this case, this was, I think, the first place where they went immediately 100%, where they auctioned off permits. Obviously, the cap wasn't very tight because it was pretty cheap. $2 per ton to $3.50 a ton is what we've seen in those auctions. With the $3.50 was early on, and so it's been pretty inexpensive. Okay, carbon tax examples. So Australia just put on the carbon tax on the 50 largest emitters, and so the Australian dollar is worth a little more than the U.S. dollar, about I think it's 1.15 or in that range. And that started this year. And it actually, data's coming in, it actually is working because they've gotten pretty significant reductions among these emitters at this 23 Australian dollars per metric ton tax. So far, the Australian economy has not collapsed. I'm just happy to report that. Over time, so they've got this few years where they're going to use a carbon tax, and then they're going to transition to a cap and trade. The stuff that I've read is they were thinking about harmonizing with the European market, right? So if they have a ton of emissions, at some point they will like to join that trading system, and so they'll transition to cap and trade. India has put on a tax on coal. It's pretty small, okay. $1 per metric ton of coal, and I think burn a ton of coal, it emits about a little over 3 tons of CO2. So that's a pretty cheap tax, but they're are moving in that direction, and they have a very ambitious scheme on the books, but it really hasn't kicked in yet. Japan just implemented carbon tax, and it's kind of complicated, so I just decided not to try to go into it. One of the things that I mentioned about Japan, though, is they're really lead on carbon. And so when they start crimping down, they already have really high energy prices, so it really is hard on them. Denmark also has a carbon tax that's been in place for a while. They've had different variations, but this is the current level of taxation on carbon in Denmark. Okay. So the papers that I always have my students read, and I should have referenced them in the slide, so there were a couple of nice papers that were written in something called the Hamilton Project, which I think is Brookings Institute. Gilbert Metcalf and Rob Stavins wrote companion papers. So Rob Stavins was assigned, he actually really wanted to write taxes, but he was assigned cap and trade, and so the idea was he would write a paper about, give us an idealized cap and trade system for the U.S., and Metcalf wrote about taxes. Okay? And so they had some good ideas, and I think very conventional wisdom on what economists think should, either some sort of a scheme for reducing emissions in the United States should look at. Total emissions, CO2 emissions, about 1.5 billion metric tons per year. So start thinking about a $20 carbon tax, or there's some serious money floating around here. We can think, most of the discussions are gradually increasing trajectory of emissions reductions. So let me talk a little bit about the point of regulation. The point of regulation. So one possibility is, and this is the one that gets discussed most, is to have what's called upstream regulation. So if you think about it, when we import oil importers at that point have to pay a carbon tax. Have to pay a carbon tax, or they have to buy a permit. And you can look at it in either of those schemes. Similarly, when you take coal out of the ground in the great state of Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin, when they take it out and start shipping it out, at that point there's a carbon tax that's placed on it. Right? Similarly, natural gas at the wellhead, you could put a carbon tax. So that's called an upstream point of regulation. One of the benefits of upstream regulation is you have to deal with the smallest number of people. Right? You have to deal with the smallest number of people. You can think about moving it down. Right? You can think about moving it down where when you pay gas at the pump, right, this is really downstream, when you pay gas at the pump, you see a carbon tax at the gas pump. Right? So instead, if it were a refinery, you could basically what would happen is they would pay a tax on it, or they'd have to buy a permit, right? And they would pass that cost on to you. Right? So we can think about upstream regulation versus downstream regulation and stuff in between. Conventional wisdom is that upstream regulation has the virtue of being most comprehensive. Right? Being most comprehensive. All of the examples that I gave you earlier, those are either partial tax systems or partial cap and trade systems. This would be the stuff that's being discussed would be more comprehensive. Okay, so there's some revenue considerations. Let me see. I'm going to check this one time. Okay. Let me kind of pass through these quickly because I don't want to take up all of Jay's time. So for cap and trade, we'd like to auction these off. Right? I think that's the conventional wisdom. Well, how could we use the revenue? So a lot of the discussion in Washington now is if we did something, we'd have all this revenue available. So possible uses of revenue, deficit reduction is a really big one. The Congressional Research Service, they're all about, the report that they just released is an awful lot about how much money will be generated. We could use money, and this is where Japan is using their carbon tax, would be to subsidize innovation and efficiency. Right? So you could give credits for installing solar panels and things like that. Economists have talked a lot about reducing distortionary taxes. Right? And Metcalf's paper is very nice, because what he looks at is he looks at reducing payroll taxes, which economists think about payroll taxes are distortionary because they discourage people from working. They're nice regulatory points for raising taxes, but it distorts the labor market. So overall, we'd like to reduce those distortions, and we can use revenue from either a carbon tax or from cap and trade to reduce these distortionary taxes. if you think about it, we could tax people and we could hand it right back to them, right? So then that's neutral. And so net caps paper looks at trying to achieve where we return all the revenue right back to people, right? And target using the payroll tax. So you basically just give it right back to them. So that's one possibility. And you're reducing discretionary taxes, and so you could have some benefit from that. International trade. Okay, so one of the things that gets talked about a lot is if we unilaterally put on a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, then the producers in our country face higher prices, right? Because they're facing the cost of carbon, whereas people importing from other countries that don't have any sort of carbon tax, they can do it more cheaply because they face cheaper energy costs, right? And that turns out to be a problem because then it puts our companies in the United States or anybody that's another country that has a carbon tax or a tradable system, a cap and trade system, it puts them at a competitive disadvantage. So the primary proposals on the table are we'll tax the CO2 content of imports. So think about stuff coming from China. We're going to put a border tax on that's basically a tax with the carbon content. And then when producers export, we give them a rebate. Right? The devil is in the details on that one, because if you think about an upstream tax, you've got to figure out how much of that is, how much it increases the cost on account of the tax. So that's kind of a problem. Another problem is fair trade. Okay, so China is the World Trade Organization doesn't allow taxes that discriminate. Right? And here's one of the problems. So China they make most of their power sources from coal. Coal is hugely carbon intensive. Right? Hugely carbon intensive. So if we wanted to really tax on their carbon content, we'd have to put a tax on them that's different from a country that is less carbon intensive, right? So if we were importing Japanese stuff, the carbon content of the same item imported from Japan would be different, and that's going to be a problem. Right? That's going to be a problem. The primary proposals are, I just read a paper about this the other day, would be to tax imports at the carbon content of our manufacturing. So they've got to be uniform. All right. The last thing I want to put up, and this is kind of small, sorry about that. This comes out of that the Congressional Research Service report. So this is the impact of the impact on fuel prices for different levels of carbon tax. So at $5, I'm going to just focus on what happens to gasoline, right? Because we all go to the pump and we kind of understand gasoline, so it's the easiest one to talk about. At a $5 per ton tax on carbon, that translates into about a nickel per gallon for gasoline. Up to a $50 per ton would translate into about 50 cents per gallon. Okay. So I think relative in Colorado, I think we're about 38 cents a gallon in gasoline taxes total. Right. So you look at for a $25 tax, roughly doubling the tax, right? Roughly doubling the tax. And so, I don't know, is that a lot of money or is it not a lot of money? I don't know. That's up to you, all right? That's up to you. I was looking on Twitter and I saw that the American Manufacturers Association also released a report. And basically, I think they just released it a couple of days ago about a carbon tax and how it would kill the manufacturing sector. Right? It was the end of the be the end of the manufacturing sector. So one of the things I want to say about that is basically it's relative prices that count. Right? So at least within the United States, the way that this is set up, if you have a border tariff carbon tax, really the relative prices kind of remain the same. Right? It doesn't really create a big disadvantage. Now that's not to say that the price of goods is going to go up. If you put on a carbon tax, we have energy and everything. Right? Energy is in everything. So the price of that stuff is going to go up. Now, and it won't go up proportionally, right? Because some things are really energy intensive and some things are not so. And so there are definitely going to be costs in the economy from increasing those prices. That's the $5 million question. right? It's, how much damage that's going to do on the economy. But at the same time, we're weighing that against doing nothing, right? So we know, the status quo is, we've got a problem. We've got a problem. So, any questions?
You mentioned you were going to give that money back to us. Right? So that's when that's probably out.
Yep. But not completely, right? Because it's definitely going to change relative prices. Right? It's definitely going to change relative prices. So some things you're going to do less of. And I don't really have a good handle on it. I mean, most of the discussion, you can think about your direct use of energy, but it's the embodied energy that I think is going to be pretty tricky.
Yeah, I mean, the manufacturing industry is like a big powerful lobby in Washington. Even though you give them the money back, you have to go with the discretionary taxes. I don't have lobbyists in Washington myself, right? And so, politically, it's not really good for opposition. They're extremely powerful when they want to see the taxes go up.
I don't think, my read of the tea leaves is, well, we probably won't have any of this stuff in my lifetime, but if we were, everyone's really targeting using this for deficit reduction. I think that's the one piece. So it wouldn't be, we're not going to give it back to you, but instead of raising your taxes or cutting you through the sequester, right? Instead of doing that, we're going to replace that, and we're going to fund deficit reduction through carbon tax or the proceeds from permits. So that's just the reality of it. Whether that will be as good, it seems to me like it's a lot better idea to reduce payroll taxes. Other questions?
If anyone on the phone has a question, please hit *6 to unmute yourself.
It's technology. It's not weird. Okay, I guess that's it.
Thanks for having me. My name is Jay Shogren, and we're going to transition here a bit, but there's a couple of anecdotes to make the transition smoother. The cap and trade was first talked about in '66 by Tom Crocker, who actually is just down the street now, rehabbing in near the Centura Mall. I'm not sure how you rehab, but he's right down the road from me right now. And I spent the year in the White House in '97 doing the Kyoto Protocol and arguing about cap and trade versus taxes. And most of the economists inside the White House at the time were convinced that taxes were the way to go over cap and trade, because if we had set up a global cap and trade system, which is what you needed to do, Russia would have been a monopoly seller. And so our big question was, so the Russians sold us a bunch of permits, and then they chose to do whatever they wanted to do anyway. And so what would the State Department do then? Right? So we've actually set up a system because it was to drive the price from $100 a ton if we had tried to set up a domestic market to about $10 a ton if we actually were trading with China and India and Russia. But everybody was so nervous about what they would actually do with these carbons that it all kind of collapsed, and then we started to talk about voluntary programs again, which is always a good way to avoid any problem at all. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about valuation and experiments, and I know some of you are economists and some of you aren't. So I'm going to talk about the way I think about this problem, some old work, some relatively old work, and some new work, which is so new I don't have slides for it. I'll just tell you about it. So when we think of economics, to me the definition is value created by trade. So as long as we've got trade, we're creating value. And as long as we can understand how to facilitate trade, we can understand how to create value. And valuation work then is about thinking of these values with and without markets in place. So if we have markets in place, typically all we need to do is, somebody needs to do is estimate demand and supply curves and figure out areas under triangles and do all that kind of welfare stuff we like and put on some complications like Travis likes to do and twist things around and add a few constraints and see how much deadweight loss we've got. But what interests me is over the years has been trying to get measuring value created in context with control, which doesn't sound like trade. It sounds more like an experiment in which, we put people in a room or we go out to the field or we set up a natural experiment where we actually try to get willingness to pay or values from them for different types of goods. And for me, what has ultimately mattered is not so much what we're valuing. Maybe this makes me part of the rootless intellectual elite. I don't really know what we're valuing. That's not so much interesting or where we're valuing, but that we're doing it. And we're out measuring this stuff and seeing how different ways of setting up the problem shift values out or bring them in. And so I've been sort of like a little butterfly floating around from thing to thing as I try to measure these values. I was going to bring the book, but there it is. I couldn't find it in my office. I must have gave it away. So this is a shameless self-promotion of all the stuff we've done in valuation in experiments, and we've summarized it in this book. And I was going to have it here in case you had asked me something I didn't know. I'd say it's in the book, but it's in the book. So here's my mindset. I've used this forever. Because economists sit up there in markets, environmental economists typically work with missing markets. And once you open up values and valuation, you introduce psychology, ecology, sociology, anthropology, all the other ologies that want to have something to say about social policy that may or may not care about markets, or don't see markets as the chief organizing force of their entire discipline like we do, or like I do. And, the whole idea of markets missing markets is typically enough when we think about, say, cap and trade. We have a market, we're buying and selling energy, we have a missing market for CO2, we combine those two, we're done. Well, when we're talking about biodiversity, or we're talking about the web of life, and we're talking about all these interconnections that economists aren't the greatest dealing with, there may be markets, there may not be markets, there may be, you pound down the gopher over here and it pops up over here because you don't understand the ecological system and the interconnections, the whole ecosystem externality idea. So I'm interested in what people other than economists have to say about how to think about values to a certain point. And I don't go overboard now. I'm not too huggable. So why do you want to run an experiment in economics? Test theory, that's typically what we do. Pattern recognition, which is a lot of times say what ecologists do. Go out and try to observe patterns, and then come back with a theory, and then go back and observe. Economists are starting to do that more and more, and part of this preferences and valuation work is really part of this preference or pattern recognition, trying to understand what's happening inside of different auctions. Then economic design is what was the Nobel Prize in Economics this year to Al Ross and Shapley, was economic design, in which we're test bedding institutions in the laboratory, trying to understand how we can better match up. I think what Al Ross did was figure out matching markets between physicians and hospitals and how to do it efficiently so people could actually get to where they were needed and the people who needed them got what they needed. And actually, not a bad Nobel Prize. Okay, so when we start talking about valuation experiments, we're talking about experimental auctions. Incentive compatibility is the jargon for you telling me the truth. And how do I set up an incentive or a rule so that you give me back your true value? It's also demand revelation is another way to say the same thing, or sincere bidding, or just telling the truth, but incentive compatibility sounds more impressive. And typically, here's an incentive compatible auction, second price auction. Highest bidder wins, pays second highest bidder's price. You have no reason to lie to me. If you bid less than your true value, someone could sneak in and get it. You missed out on an opportunity. If you bid more than your true value, someone could bid higher than you wanted to, and you end up paying more than you wanted to. So the pressures are moving towards the truth. And so if we understand these type of mechanisms, hopefully we can pull out some kind of idea of value of the goods we're looking at. The other part of it is this context and control question. So if we think of control and high control and abstract context and realistic context, oftentimes that's where I am over here, doing auctions with induced values, thinking about essentially inducing a demand curve and using different institutions to see if I can get you to reveal that demand curve back to me. So it's like holding up a mirror and seeing if, instead of a fun mirror that, you're all distorted and stuff, I actually get a mirror where you look like you're supposed to. That's really what this work is all about. We're trying to eliminate sort of funhouse values by coming up with institutions so that it looks like what you actually look like. All the way up to testing new goods in the laboratory. I'll talk about that in a minute. Testing new goods in the field, and out here to non-experimental data, or just typically what we do with real-world data. Hard to see those blue lines, but there's a little triangle here. And so when we think about it, we're thinking about your preferences, your values up here, institutions, and then trying to get you to think about real behavior. So we're trying to combine those in a way that I'm picking an institution that controls your behavior, incentive compatible, and then I come up here and I measure your preferences. That's the whole notion behind it. So the history, Peter Bohm, back in Sweden in 1970s, Peter Bohm actually argued against the clean development mechanisms for just the reason you said back in when they were initially being proposed to the European Union trading system. He argued and argued and argued and argued and lost, but he was right. Well, now he died. So it doesn't really help much for him. Jeff Bennett in Australia started doing it. Vernon Smith started doing a bit of this work in the 80s. He won a Nobel Prize. Schultze, Brookshire, Coursey up in Wyoming did it. They actually ran some experiments down here in Fort Collins, going door to door, selling trees in parks here. So some of the trees you see in some of the parks are because somebody was willing to pay, and they planted these trees 20-some years ago. So they're probably nice big trees. Now I can't flag which ones they are. Menkhaus and Hoffman, Betsy Hoffman, who was the president of CU for a while there, and then there's the Iowa State guys, which I was part of, and we auctioned off poison food. And then Jason Lusk in Oklahoma State and his crew, and they've auctioned off golden rice and just about every agriculture product under the sun. And nowadays, Paul Ferrero at Georgia State is working on auctioning off conservation lands, auctioning off water, trying to use these experimental markets or different ways to get at these values. So I came into it somewhere here in the 80s as a student up in Wyoming, and Brookshire, Coursey, and Schultze were auctioning off SOA, which is a really foul-tasting liquid. And nobody's been able to replicate it because no internal review board has approved it after that. So I got it full on because I could hear the people screaming down the hall when they actually had to taste it. And I thought, well, if this is economics, I'm in. Okay. So testing values, and here's sort of the big thing. You want to test these values, and if you have a breakdown between baselines, rationality typically, we have to try to explain it, and this is where all the other disciplines come in, behavioral economics, psychology trying to sharpen economics, sociology trying to sharpen economics by introducing social norms, psychology by adding all their different heuristics and biases, and trying to invent degrees of freedom based on emotions. That's a tricky thing. The other way to do it is eliminate the gap or any kind of bad behavior, any funhouse values, ex ante, by constructing the institutions or the incentive scheme. And here's the key part of it, is that now if you're departing from rationality, it's not because you're you, it's because the market is not disciplining you to be more rational, because we don't have a market. And so how do we make these decisions? I told you I would spend my time in that far corner in the abstract world. Right? But this is important because we often just assume rationality and then things break down and you wonder why. Is it bad theory? Is it bad measurement tools? Is it both? How do we know? I mean, if you go to a car mechanic and says, well, you either got a flat tire or your carburetor's broke, you kind of want to know which one, right? And so it's the same kind of idea here. And some of the issues over the years have been the gap in willingness to pay, willingness to accept. Is it a gap? Is it a value? Two measures of value. How much you're willing to pay to get the good, how much you're willing to accept to give up the good. There can be the same under certain conditions as substitutability. There can be a gap if there's no substitutes, but then there's behavior reasons of pivoting utility curves and reference-dependent utility and probability weighting and framing effects and all sorts of different ways to explain this gap. And sorting this out becomes pretty important because the value of statistical life, $7 million here in the U.S., derives a lot of policies. Right? Like the diesel rule that was passed a few years back had, I think it was $70 billion in benefits when they calculated it, and I believe $63 billion of it were from value of statistical life coming from willingness to pay measures. If they had used willingness to accept measures, it probably would have been $700 billion or $7 trillion if they had used them. I mean, the gap between the two measures are big enough to really sway policy. Ambiguity aversion, I'll come back to that one, preference reversals, and context dependence. This is the big one. Economics in general assumes your preferences are context independent. You have preferences, they're set, they change when you get new information, but you really only change when you have changes in relative prices. But what happens in valuation is you have context-dependent preferences and demands, and your preferences are like a pinwheel, and I can frame the question so I can extract the answer I want by how I frame it. And when it becomes that wishy-washy about your preferences, then, my values really are not that helpful. Because I can gin up any number one way or another, push it up, push it down by how I frame it, because now your preference is what Danny Kahneman calls transient artifacts. His joke is the old umpire joke. A strike is a strike. A strike is nothing till I call it a strike. And the same thing with your preferences. Are your preferences preferences, or are your preferences only something that emerge once I ask you for your preferences? And if that's the case, then we're in trouble, because our economics anybody can beat us at our own game. So here's the trick, though, if we think about context dependence. So every science needs a baseline. Ours is rational behavior, consistent choices, basically rational behavior. And lower is just random behavior. And what's been the big debate in economics and valuation work is, as a new upper baseline, what is homo contextual, reasonable? What is reasonable? Well, everybody has a different idea what reasonable is in economics. And so we have rational here, we have random here, and now as we're trying to understand behavior, we have reasonable. Well, half empty, half full, what's reasonable to you, or da-da-da-da-da. I mean, it's kept me busy because it's an interesting question. I don't know if we pinned down a baseline, and here's why. For 200 years, the only thing economists were afraid of was risk. And, risk averse. We like safe bets more than risky bets in general, except for you guys in Colorado who have the lottery, right? I mean, clearly payoffs are negative, so you must be risk lovers here. But besides that fact, over the last 20 years, we've added a bunch of problems to economics. Loss aversion, myopic loss aversion, ambiguity, inequality, lying, guilt, regret, disappointment, stress, extremeness, delay, tax aversion. We can put on stuff on tax aversion. Not tax avoidance, but tax aversion, which you've talked about too. And now what's reasonable in this list? Which one should I go with? Risk seemed okay. Loss aversion, well, kind of. Okay, so I freak out at losses more than I'm happy about gains. Okay, I can kind of buy that. Ambiguity aversion, if you've got a distribution, a compound lottery, you got lotteries over lotteries over lotteries, and you really can't sort out what's happening in climate change, yeah, okay, that kind of freaks me out. I'm going to try to avoid that. Lying aversion, to my mom. Guilt aversion, to my wife. Regret aversion. I mean, they're all context dependent. I mean, I don't know which one to add, to tell you the truth. So, if we go back and we think about one aspect here of valuation, we think about preference reversals. This is one that's kind of troubling in the sense that you prefer a safe lottery over a risky lottery. Like I said, you're risk averse, but you assign a higher value to the risky lottery than the safe lottery. You just can't do that. Those are context-dependent preferences, right? You've told me A is better than B, but now you told me B is better than A with a different measure. It's like Fahrenheit and centigrade measuring distance to the moon in one case and temperature in another. I mean, that doesn't work. And what typically happens is if you give people these lotteries, I can generally get you to do it about 40 to 50% of the time, depending on the lotteries I give you. And if we're having to try to make public policy based on environmental lotteries, which in my mind most environmental policy is, because you never solve anything. I mean, you just move the probability of distribution a little further to the right or to the left, depending on what you do. There's very little certainty in any of this stuff. We do have an issue because these are the things I'm measuring, but this is what you told me. Now, typically there's nothing I can do. In a market I could do this. I could sell you A, right? I might have mixed this up. What did I say? Yeah. So I'm going to sell you B, actually, because I screwed this up. Oops, now I totally screwed it up. Hold on. What did I do? Okay, I'm going to hit it and see what happens. Okay. Well, this should be B. I mixed those up. So I'm going to sell you B for 1,000. I'm going to trade you for the one you prefer, which is A. Then I'm going to buy back A for 400. So what did I do? I sold you for 1,000. I bought back at 400. That means you got neither lottery and you ended up with minus $600. This is a money pump. This is, P.T. Barnum. When you come in and I sell you what you told me, I give you what you want, and I buy back at a lower price. You can usually get people to stop doing this within 1 or 2 rounds. They'll just go, oh, that was no fun. And you don't have to mock them. You don't have to laugh at them. You don't have to do anything. There's no social pressure. They just really say, wow, that inconsistency was painful in the pocket. And you can, this is an old experiment now from 10 years ago, where here's round, here are reversal rates, so you can see they're up at about 30%. We introduced arbitrage here, and you can see we knocked down reversal rates in markets here. This is our control treatment where we didn't have arbitrage money pumps. And you can see that we pretty much knocked it out. But what's so exciting about this for me is that at the same time we asked a bunch of non-market valuation questions that were hypothetical and about wildlife in Yellowstone at the same time as they're answering market questions. So we got the same phenomena that once we introduced arbitrage in the other market, it actually spilled over to the decisions that were being made in the non-market case. So I created the people we assume exist. I was pretty excited with that. I took an institution, instead of trying to make the world more like, what did I do? I didn't want to make the model more like the world. I wanted to make the world more like the model. And I did, with the right choice of institution. To me, that's commitment. Did it change their preferences or their values? No, their preferences were rock solid. It just got them to reevaluate those risky events. Right? It's just like the lottery here. $10 billion Powerball, very small probability. If you disconnect probability and severity and just look at the one that thrills you, you are no longer an expected utility maximizer. You are doing something else. And by arbitraging you, it shoves the probabilities and severities back together and you get a little bit more real. We actually ended up applying this to cutthroat trout and lake trout in Yellowstone Lake as a way to parameterize a bioeconomic model. Couple minutes here. Measuring preferences we talked about this a little bit. Bohm again. Main costs, we're doing vacuum packed meat. What we've done is food safety, irradiated meat, GM, growth hormones, fat, fish farm salmon, fish farm cod, and auction these goods off to try to get a demand curve for products that are kind of spooky. Right? With information, pro information, with con information, with verifiable information, which is like a citizens group gets together and collects it all and gives the best knowledge. And so what we're interested in is how demand curves shift for these goods. And I'm an environmental economist. I wasn't so much interested in food safety, but I couldn't deliver the risks of a grizzly bear in the lab. Right? I couldn't deliver the risks of endangered species in the lab. And so when the agriculture guys came and said, we had food safety money, you want to help? I was like, absolutely. This is the closest I'm going to ever get to poisoning people for real. And so we ran these experiments in Iowa State where they have a food tasting center, just like here, I think, at CSU. And we've got an irradiator there and, growth hormones. People in Iowa were not afraid of this. When we ran those experiments in Berkeley, though, they totally freaked out. And today, I can't even keep track of all the people doing these sort of evaluation experiments in the lab for new products. I'm thrilled. I get to review them. I can't even review them. I just send them to somebody else because I just can't keep track. I'm ecstatic that other people thought this was useful. But here's the problem. Unlike the natural sciences, we cannot create a people vacuum. Our environment is going to affect values somehow or another. The institution we pick is going to affect values. Prices are going to affect values. External information that I can't control because you had a life before you came in here. You'll have a life afterwards. I can't do nothing about it. Retail markets, I can't control prices in the universe, so I don't know every price you're going to face when you leave. And that's the whole outside options. And part of, all these papers that have been done looking at this have been trying to address these type of questions and how sensitive the values are to all these different choices you make in any kind of experiment because of this notion that we don't have a people vacuum. And as much as we try to control stuff, we can't. I've had a few graduate students who've been super aggressive in the control, where they've just not quite screamed at people. But it was like, your voice just before it screams. And I thought, I don't think this is control, guys. And we had to go back and say, no, just explain the instructions to them. You cannot intimidate them into doing this. Right? So there can be monitor effects, too, and which I did not anticipate. And the last thing I want to chit-chat about for a second is this notion of commitment. And we like commitment. And typically we like commitment because it's real money spent on real products in real markets. You put your money where your mouth is, all the cliches. And so how do we do this in stated preference methods? Where commitment is much weaker because I'm just asking you to tell the truth. And, you got your reasons, you may be distracted. And so how do we create commitment in hypothetical markets? And one thing we've done over the last few years now is turn to social psychology and this oath idea. And the reason we wanted the oath is because we started doing real exchange and hypothetical exchange, and we saw a difference. And I was convinced in my mind it's just because the budget constraint doesn't hold in hypothetical questions. But started thinking about it, and a lot of these real auctions we've done, you can end up deflating bids because the participation constraint doesn't hold. The only way out of this auction that we've created for you for real is just to bid zero and you're done and you can walk out. That's called protest bidding and contingent valuation. But in auctions, you're not supposed to have protest bidders. I mean, that ain't supposed to happen. Until I looked at one set of experiments, and here is the hypothetical bids for a baseball card. Cal Ripken Jr. baseball card, so 450 was the big one. And to me, this was a nice, good comparable to the environment because it is a piece of cardboard. I mean, truly, it's not worth anything. It is a piece of cardboard this big with a guide picture on it. Why is it worth $450? Well, you just love Cal Ripken Jr., don't you? Right? So here we're at a Denver sports show with a bunch of people who love sports at the height of Cal Ripken's Iron Man 3 million game thing. And here's the hypothetical bid. And then the way we ran the auction was hypothetical, and then we said, oh, and by the way, we got the real one. Let's do a real auction. Well, we thought, man, they inflated these values too. Look here, and you realize nearly 60% of the people who were at a sports card show, who were obviously sports cards nuts, bid zero. So the most popular sports guy in the country. And to me, that was like, oh, boy, we screwed up the experiment. We boxed them in a corner. If you ever go to buy a car and they put you in the box, have you ever been in the box? When they get you in the corner and they got the two salesmen that got you pinned. We had those people in the box, and the only way to react was they couldn't punch us. They couldn't, start screaming. They were in a sports card show. It was a sports card. So they just did zero. So the whole idea of the oath is to somehow get those people to pay attention and get those people engaged. So we ran, you can't really read it, this is the solemn oath. I swear upon my honor to always provide honest answers. That's the oath. There it is. We ran these in Paris for the Sorbonne students. And so that was our main group that we've worked on over the years. And it really is just an oath. It's just a commitment device. You have committed yourself to be the type of person to tell the truth by signing this oath. We gave the oath way before they ever knew what the experiment was about. And eventually the experiment came about to value dolphins, adopting dolphins. And so when we gave the bids, you can see here's our baseline, which is hypothetical. And you can see a bunch of people clustering up here around 30 euros. We gave them a 25 euro endowment. So you can see a lot of people clustering up here, which would say your budget constraints not binding. And over here on the real auction, we see a bunch of people clustering around zero for a dolphin. I mean, who would pay zero for a dolphin? Give me a break. I mean, who doesn't love dolphins? Who loves dolphins? Yeah, right? I mean, 25% of the people, French, smart students in the Sorbonne don't love a dolphin? I don't believe that either. So we got two problems. We did the oath, and there we go. We pulled those people in, pulled those people out. Does it prove it works? No. Is it suggestive? Yes. Is it a pattern recognition exercise? Absolutely. Did it satisfy my initial, sorry about that, people on that other line. Did it satisfy my initial belief about holding the budget constraint in check and getting the participation constraint? Yeah. So other people have tried to replicate it now in China and in Sweden, and they found can't remember how it goes. In China, there was no significant difference, and in Sweden there was, or vice versa. And I asked them to explain why that would be difference between China and Sweden, and I still haven't got an answer on that one yet. So, when we do this, we think about valuation as a social construct, even though we're asking your individual values. So I don't want to ask you your individual values in isolation. I want to put them in the construct of which our theories are developed in economics, which is the market, or at least exchange. And so I'm doing my best here to frame these questions as exchange questions. And I know, I'm not the only one. I mean, this is where contingent valuation gets its name. Complete contingent, error to prove complete contingent claims contracts. Right? Boom. It's right out of missing markets. But the question is, there is no money pump. What do you do? How do you rationalize that stuff? How do you generalize it? How do you build institutions to create or generate rational values? Or how do you know when the institutions are too weak that it's not really the theory's problem, it's not really the measurement tool's problem, it's the theory's problem. This is right here. Your self-help program. I thought I'd do an experiment, but we can save that for another day because I'm sort of out of time. I'll leave it up. So, in case you're interested, the best thing I can tell you about experimental economics is other people want you to run their experiments for them. Typically, you have to really defend yourself against that and really have your nuts and bolts down why you made every particular choice. Otherwise, it's like red meat to the lions in terms of why did you do that? And typically, even if you did it all right, at the end of it, you have way more questions than you ever imagined. The one question you answer. So, which is why probably I'm still doing it 25 years later. I think I'm still doing it. Yeah, thank you. Questions? Dial *6.
Was there a question you can ask them what they wanted? And you got somebody, something about the thing on fire, you got some Europe,
Right. So, this was within sample, so you would come up, hypothetically, how much do you want to pay for this Cal Ripken card? And you thought very little zeros. And then we would say to them, okay, step to this table over here. And they go to the table over here, and we'd say, all right, we're doing this for real. What's your bid now? 0. Which one was the true answer? The hypothetical question might have been a little higher than they really would have paid. The 0 probably is lower than they would have paid. And so, to me, that was experimental design. That we didn't switch those around. But if we had switched them around and said, all right, we're going to do this for real, now go to this table and say, oh, let's just do it for fun now. Why? I did it for real over here. Why am I doing it for fun now? So the ordering effect really matters. And I think the way we set it up, I think of the box as, in a used car, a car sales ship, that I got no way out of it. 0. So now, if I'm going to do a lab experiment, I've got to give them an outside option that if they don't want to participate, I have things out for sale, just outside the door here. Or there are other places you can buy them. For irradiated food, that was harder, right? I mean, there was no place else I could buy irradiated food. So, in that sense, we had to compare what happened in the lab to what happened in a hypothetical survey to actually convincing a store in Ames, Iowa to sell a radiated food as part of their regular day-to-day thing, and have a grad student sit behind that glass door, in the meat room and flag how many people came and bought the irradiated food, looked at the irradiated food. And we found in that case that both the experimental auction and the hypothetical survey were horrible. Both of them were off by a mile, as opposed when people actually got there and saw Twin Rivers chicken as the irradiating industry wants to call it, electronically pasteurized. And people, they walked away. So even though I was convinced that, the stuff in the retail would be as good as the stuff in the lab because it was both real. No. When the rubber really hit the road and they did really have options of walking away, most of them walked away. There's been other studies now too that have tried to replicate field markets versus lab versus surveys, and we can dig up the results, but I'm not sure how they all come out. There's lots of them.